Wonderful. Thank you all for gathering here. As the judge said, there's so much happening in the world right now. So really appreciate everyone taking the time to join us for the next 60, 75 minutes on this extremely important subject matter. So for those who don't know me, I am Juliette Chayton-Lefcourt. I'm a board member of the National Council of Jewish Women, the San Francisco section. For those of you who don't know, the National Council of Jewish Women San Francisco, it is a grassroots social justice organization of volunteers and advocates of any gender, ethnicity, race, faith, and national origin who turn progressive ideals into action. We are inspired by Jewish values. For over 120 years, NCJWSF has been fighting for social justice by improving the quality of life for women, children, and families, and by safeguarding individual rights and freedoms. It is very important for the organization to put together this conversation due to the Jewish proverb that many of us live by, Tikkun Olam, repair the world. We want to leave the world in a better place than we found it. And for many Jews, this is through social and political engagement. So on that note, I like to begin by doing quick bios on the panelists. I could go on and on about each of them, but we have such a little time, so I'm going to make it brief. And then we will jump into questions that we've collected from our community members. So I will begin. Jason Boudin is the district attorney for the city and county of San Francisco. He was elected in November 2019 on a progressive platform centered on ending mass incarceration, protecting crime survivors, and addressing the root causes of crime. He personally understands the impact of incarceration, as both of his parents were incarcerated throughout his childhood. Before becoming DA, he worked as a public defender in San Francisco, where he helped lead the office's bail reform unit. Some of his renowned policies while he's DA include eliminating bail, ending racist sentencing enhancements, discouraging the police from using racist pretextual stops, providing diversion opportunities for parents in the justice system, and ensuring that cases relying solely on the word of officers with documented serious misconduct are not prosecuted. Welcome, DA Boudin. Retired Judge Ladoris Hazard Cordell was the first lawyer to open a law practice in East Palo Alto, a low-income community of color. In '78, she was appointed Assistant Dean for Student Affairs at Stanford Law School, where she implemented a successful minority admissions program. In '82, she was appointed to the Municipal Court of Santa Clara County. And a few years later, she won the election to the Superior Court, making her the first African-American woman to sit on the Superior Court in Northern California. In 2003, she won a 4-year term on the Palo Alto City Council and was the independent police auditor for the city of San Jose for 5 years. She is also the author of Her Honor, which provides an insider account in our legal system. Welcome, Judge. Otis R. Taylor Jr. is supervising senior editor of race and equity at KQED. His focus is on the role of systematic inequity in journalism, working with reporters and senior editors to bring a cultural competency to story production and editing as they reframe the station's coverage of diverse communities. Previously, he was an East Bay columnist for the San Francisco Chronicle and an investigative reporter at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. While at the San Francisco Chronicle, he extensively covered housing, policing, race, and inequality. For that work, he received the 2020 Journalist of the Year Award from the NorCal chapter of the Society of Professional Journalists. Welcome, Otis. Assistant Sheriff Tanzanika Carter has over 25 years of law enforcement experience. She is currently the Assistant Sheriff for the San Francisco Sheriff's Office. She served 21 years with the Bay Area Rapid Transit District, for many of us, BART, their police department, promoting to the rank of lieutenant, overseeing 50 plus personnel in Contra Costa County. She also assists with the Racial Equity Action Plan for the Sheriff's Alliance for Equity team. And last but not least, she is a lifetime member of the National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Executives, also known as NOBLE. Welcome, Assistant Sheriff. I do want to make two flags before I begin the questions. We did invite SF Police Chief Bill Scott, and he was unable to attend nor able to send a representative. Also, DA Boudin needs to sign off at 6:30. So I may direct more questions to him before he leaves, and I'll give him a few minutes before he leaves, like I will offer for the others. So now I will begin the questions, and apologies for all my talking. I know we want to get into some great questions. So we're all on the same page as much as possible. Question for each of the panelists. How would you define criminal justice reform in 2 to 3 sentences? Otis, would love to start with you, and then Assistant Sheriff, DA, and the judge. If Otis, you'd like to begin.
Non-existent. That is my answer, Juliet.
Oh no, I'm here with you. Assistant Sheriff.
Oh, thank you for that. So criminal justice reform to me is a holistic approach to addressing the main causes of recidivism and racial inequity. For us at the Sheriff's Office, we look at things again in this holistic approach, and we know that not everybody needs to be in jail. And so when we talk about reform, we need to talk about change. I'm with Mr. Taylor here that there needs to be more change. What I like to tell people is that I've been in law enforcement for 25 years, but I've been Black like all my life. And so I understand where he's coming from. But reform is definitely change, and it's definitely needed.
Thank you. DA Boudin.
Criminal justice reform is a recognition that policies of the past have not worked to make us safer or to give meaning to the phrase criminal justice, and that we need to do things differently if we want to build safe, vibrant communities, the kind of communities that I want to raise my son in, that all of us want our families to grow up in. And I hear the frustration from Otis, because there's a lot of talk and there's not been a lot of action or progress. We have a lot of work to do to change the system. And I want to be really clear, this is about making our community safer. And we know that the reforms that are being discussed and that we'll get a chance to talk about tonight are not simply to give meaning to constitutional rights or to promote equity. They're critical if we are to live in the kind of safe communities we all deserve.
Thank you. And last but not least, Judge.
There is no criminal justice system. And I in fact, never refer to the criminal system as a justice system. It has never been about justice. And so I call it a criminal legal system. And it is I don't call it put justice in, because our criminal legal system is broken. It's broken in so many ways. That being said, there are fixes. There are ways that are possible to bring justice to our criminal legal system by way of a variety of reforms. But just going in, you will never hear me refer to a criminal justice system, because it has never existed in America.
Thank you. Sheriff Carter, as we kind of try to level set on, the criminal justice system and reform, would love just a quick understanding of when it comes to SF County, what's the difference between the police and the sheriff's department? What are their various jobs and roles? How do you guys work together?
Yeah, so the police department basically handles all the streets for us, and we handle the jails. We are all the justice involved persons, but we also have clients who are the hospital. We do security at City Hall. So we go to police academies like everyone else. We have the same powers and authorities that the police office does. We just are the sheriffs, and we handle civil matters. So when people get evicted, we handle those civil matters. We handle the courts. So you'll see us doing security in the courts, and we handle the jails.
So given you are in the jails, what are you seeing as the racial breakdown of the jail system in San Francisco? And is mass incarceration real?
So the breakdown for us in our jail system is still pretty high for African Americans. I should have brought the slide. We do monthly meetings with a lot of our justice partners because, of course, you all, and thank you, you hold us accountable. And we have check-ins with our justice and justice partners in regards to who is in our jails. And there is a increase, or not increase, but the large amount, I want to say 40%, but please don't hold me on that, is more African Americans. For mass incarceration is, I do have the definition here, is incarceration in the United States is a primary form of punishment and rehabilitation. And when I looked at that word punishment, for us in the Sheriff's Department, we are not.
Oh my
punishing.
God, I can hear him.
What we do is consequences. We hold people accountable for behaviors. And so we have a different mindset in our jail. We want to make sure that when people leave our jail, we set them up for success. And that's why we have 5 keys and these other programs that are in our jails, because we want people to leave there better than when they came. But there is a higher amount of African Americans, and I'm sorry I don't have that percentage for you tonight to show you.
Mm-hmm. I think that, leads in nicely to the conversation that is reported in the new Jim Crow book that many of us have read. And it argues that the US criminal justice system is being used as a contemporary system of racial control, even as it adheres to the principle of color blindness. Otis, could you dig into that a little bit? Do you agree with this description? Given the number of Black men in the system, it sounds that the system is racist.
Of course, the system is racist, but this is nothing new. California entered the Union as a free state in 1850, but enslavers were allowed to keep their human property, Black people, to work in the mines, to work in the fields. In 1852, California passed the Fugitive Slave Act, which allowed enslavers to re-enslave people they had set free. I want to just say this about this country and this state. Black men and sometimes women and children were arrested and convicted of crimes for Black codes, state laws aimed at disenfranchising Black people after emancipation. Being unemployed was a crime. Actually, it still is. We still criminalize poverty in this country. So you have Black people that were sentenced after emancipation, and then they were leased back to the plantation owners, convict leasing. So what we're seeing right now, we're talking about mass incarceration. This is nothing new in this country. We've always had mass incarceration for people of color. And in California, we have definitely had this disenfranchisement of Indigenous people, Asian people, and especially Black and brown people.
Judge, you've had an insider's look, as your book describes, on the system. Do you have a similar perspective as well?
So when I think of our legal system, it has the best possible principles you could ever have, the best in the world. The right for the pursuit of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, the right to a speedy trial, the right against self-incrimination, the right to due process. Those principles were promulgated by propertied white men, some of whom owned people who looked like me and Otis and Sheriff Carter. They did not intend those wonderful principles to apply to women, to poor people, and to people of color. And so the problem in our legal system, be it the criminal system, the civil side, it is in the implementation. The struggle is to have a system with these wonderful principles that apply equally to everyone, people of color, women, poor people. That is the struggle, and that is the goal. So we have a system, understandably, that in which racism is baked into the legal system. It's just baked in every single part of it. And it is a system that is so biased in it against people of color and poor people that we end up with a US Supreme Court starting in 1967 that issued decisions that gave superpowers to law enforcement. And most of those powers have been utilized to oppress people of color and poor people.
So Boudin, DA Boudin, given all these challenges and problems that exist currently and have existed for so many years beforehand, how do we achieve criminal justice reform?
I want to take a moment and just reflect on where this thread in the conversation started. I don't have the exact statistics that you asked Sheriff Carter for either, but I can tell you that our county jail is roughly 50% African-American in a city that's about 3%, 4% African-American. When I took office back in 2020, just 2 short years ago, we looked at the numbers and we realized that San Francisco was incarcerating African-Americans at rates that dwarfed the Russian Gulag. Let that sink in for a minute. We can talk about mass incarceration, and some folks want to say we've ended it in San Francisco or in California. But if you're in a Black or brown community in San Francisco, you are literally being incarcerated at rates that are higher than the Russian Gulag. So we have a lot of work to do when it comes to building safety and addressing a history that you just heard Judge Cordell and Otis talk about that is deeply, deeply connected to structural and institutional racism. When it comes to how we fix that, I think it's really in the weeds, it's in the details. It's one step at a time, looking at individual policies, at individual practices, and it is recognizing and owning a history in which, as Michelle Alexander writes about so eloquently in The New Jim Crow, the criminal legal system has been used as part of a much wider net that involves education discrimination, housing discrimination, healthcare discrimination, employment discrimination. And then you criminalize poverty, and you end up with a institutionalized system of racism that in the individual case can perhaps justify the outcome, but ends up with higher incarceration rates for Black men in San Francisco than under the Russian Gulag, right? I want to go back for a moment to where I got interested in criminal justice reform, Juliet, because as you mentioned in your introduction, my parents were both incarcerated pretty much my entire life. My dad did 40 years in prison. My mom did 22 years. And it's fitting that tonight, the first day of Women's History Month, that this group would bring us together to talk about this issue, because my earliest memories as a Jewish man of celebrating Passover were in my mother's prison visiting room. We actually used to go in and do a full Seder dinner in the prison visiting room. It was the only time I was allowed into the prison as a child after normal visiting hours. And we would search the prison visiting room for the Afikomen. And one of the things that I learned through those Seders and through years of experiencing Jewish culture and heritage was a phrase that you already mentioned, Juliet, Tikkun Olam, heal the world. When we think about the damage that has been done over generations, not just to African Americans through the kind of racism we've been talking about, but to all of us. And there's no, in my view, more articulate thinker and writer on this topic than James Baldwin, who makes very clear that the problem with racism in America is not one that's limited to impacting African Americans, but it's one that infects all of us who live here. And it's something that cannot be solved in one day or with one election or with one policy. We have to understand that these are deeply rooted. These are challenges that affect and impact all of us and that make us less safe as a community. That's a lesson that I've learned from day one visiting my parents in prison. And it's one that led me to dedicate my life to trying to give meaning to that phrase, Tikkun Olam. Let's heal the world one step at a time, one day at a time, one decision at a time. And let's recognize that we are trying to solve problems that were centuries in the making.
Yeah. Judge Cordell, can you touch on maybe some of the tactics and strategies when it comes to criminal justice reform? I know there's a lot of conversation around no money bail, bail reform, not trying juveniles as adults. Could you dig into that? And then others would love for you to chime too.
So I'm sorry, you're asking about just in general, how the reforms that are out there?
Yeah,
with
I
regard
think
to-
here we've kind of given ourselves like a little bit of an important, but like a history lesson on where we've been and where we are currently. And if we do want to move forward with a reform, what are some of those tactics and strategies that you think might be best, or that we are currently trying to work through as we speak? Bail reform, gang allegations, death penalty.
I don't want those participating in this to become overwhelmed by the many things that need to be done to bring equity, to bring fairness to our criminal legal system, because it's very easy to become overwhelmed. There are so many pieces that are broken. And yes, the ones you've named, they're all things that people are doing to try to make things better. I just want to focus on, and one and two in particular. One is just, how do people get pulled into the criminal legal system? It happens on the streets, and it happens with policing. And I hope that people will continue to focus on policing in America. And the biggest issue I see is, how do you deal with a culture in law enforcement? And these cultures generally are created by a strong union and a strong union leader. And I have no problem with unions. I would never cross a picket line, but law enforcement unions are not typical unions. They basically circle the wagons and just look out only for themselves. And they uniformly oppose reform efforts to our legal system. So I hope that some time can be spent just thinking about how you can bring a cultural shift and a change to policing in America, where most of the contacts between the public and law enforcement are with traffic stops. And we really need to think about policing and how we can just change the basic culture. I have some ideas about that, and certainly Berkeley is looking at taking the traffic stop function away from policing and giving it to community, people in the community who know people in the community. It hasn't been implemented yet, but it's certainly been talked about. The other issue I want to bring up, and it's not, again, generally talked about, but I mentioned earlier that it is the courts, starting with the US Supreme Court, that has issued decisions starting in 1967 that have really been biased in favor of law enforcement, to the detriment, especially to poor people and people of color, which is one reason why I'm so glad that President Biden has nominated a Black woman who has experience as a public defender to bring that experience to the table and in the room where they have their conference meetings to talk about these issues. So it's very important, before anybody jumps into these reforms, to be informed about the various moving parts here. It's so important to know how our courts have impacted and basically been an obstacle to bringing about change. So we're going to have to look at our judges, our appellate judges, our Supreme Court justices, to be a part of the fix.
Thank you. I want to come back to this and the police union, but Assistant Sheriff Carter, I saw your hand up, so I want to make sure I give you the floor.
So many great things that are being said today. I want to bring it back real shortly to, how do we fix it? Because I really look at this again as all of us. It's not a us versus them. I take this uniform off and I'm just like everybody else. And short story, last year, my brother got stopped by a police officer in an area, and a white cop and a Black cop. And literally, he thought that he was going to die that night. They said that he was drinking. He wasn't drinking. And he has 2 young daughters. And he told me that he thought he was going to die. And that's my brother. I've been in law enforcement all this time, and I could not protect him from having that experience. And so I asked him, did he make an internal complaint? Did he, call and make a complaint? And he had not done it at the time. I told that story, I think 2 weeks ago or last week, right? And so I wanted to follow up with my brother, which I did today, Miss Benita. And I'm like, did you ever make that complaint? And he said, no. And now he didn't remember what day it was. But it is very, very important that all of you hold us accountable. That's something you all can do right where you are. That's the power that you guys have. When you make a complaint, we have to investigate that complaint. We don't tell you initially what happens. I know people think, oh, nothing's ever happened. Because of the rights that Judge Cordell talked about, the POBAR rights, we won't go back and say this person did A, B, C, and D, but we investigate that. That is so important, especially nowadays. Enough people make complaints against that one officer, people are going to take notice of that. That officer is a liability. Police do not like liabilities. And so we will get that person out. We have body worn cameras now, and we check those. And so things are changing. I know, it's slow, change is slow, but things are changing for the better. I am a great component of civilian oversight. We need civilian oversight. We have to be transparent because we want to keep all of you safe. And so it starts with us, the community, checking us, holding us accountable. And when you feel that you were disrespected in any way, or we did anything wrong, you have to be okay with putting documentation on the police and allowing us to investigate and doing our job with that. The police part of it is really the low-hanging fruit. I know judge, criminal justice system, the justice legal system. I even thought about the jury system, a jury of your peers. And we say, why don't more Black people sit on juries? Or I looked online and you only get like $15 or something on the second time that you're there. How many people in poor communities can even volunteer to sit on a jury of their peers to look at a case if they can't afford to do that? So we have to start looking at that as well, of if we want to have people that look like us sit on juries, we need to pay them an equitable wage so that they can pay their bills. If you want police to act accordingly, I want you to hold us accountable, and I want you to stand up, empower yourselves, and make those complaints. Those really help. I want to reiterate, it really does help.
Going back to the police union, two questions here. First one for you, Judge. The POA, which is the Police Officer Association in San Francisco, it's the police union in SF. Can you give us a little bit more detail on who they are and really the type of power they have? And then, Boudin, I'd like to go to you and ask a follow-up question that I will get to in a second. So Judge Cordell, you first.
Sure. J. Scott Thompson was the former police chief of Camden, New Jersey. And this is what he said. He said, within a police department, culture eats policy for breakfast. You can have a perfectly worded policy, but it's meaningless if it just exists on paper. And just to give you an example, in 2019, the officer who shot and killed Philandro Castile during a routine traffic stop, this was in St. Paul, Minnesota. That officer had attended a warrior type seminar. So the police chief, when the police chief found out, he told his officers that if any of them were to attend these trainings outside of work, they would be disciplined. The union president, his name was Bob Kroll, Kroll. He responded by offering the warrior training free for the officers. And that same union president defended the officers who killed George Floyd, and he called protesters a terrorist movement. So when you think about this, the largest police union, the Fraternal Order of Police, has more than 2,000 local chapters and nearly 350,000 members. And it lobbies for officers through this collective bargaining agreements or state laws. So it's just, and their lobbying has been so effective. So in California, we have the Peace Officers Bill of Rights. and it permits the destruction of police officers' misconduct records. They can be destroyed after a certain number of years. In Chicago, they're destroyed after 5 years. In Cleveland, 2 years. California, 6 years. So in no other profession are misconduct records permitted to be destroyed. How can you hold officers accountable if their records of misconduct don't exist? So all of this is to say, we need legislation to rein in, and I don't think they're police unions, they're more police fraternities. They don't even call themselves unions. They call themselves benevolent societies and fraternal orders. We need legislation that treats that profession as other professions are treated, without all these special kind of awards or rewards that are given to them. And to do that, we need people of courage to be in the legislature to make this happen. So it is a huge problem. Again, I'm not anti-union, but when you have an organization and their whole being is to circle the wagons and look out only for themselves, that's not what unions do. Unions care about all workers, but that's not what's happening here. So it's a major shift, and I think it has to start in our state legislature.
Mhm. Thank you. DA Boudin, as the judge just mentioned, in every profession, there are wrongdoings, medical malpractice, lawyers who violate ethics, and police who violate law. So it sounds like the judge is suggesting legislation as a tactic to keep the police accountable. Would you agree? And is police accountability consistent with criminal justice reform?
Yes and yes. Let me explain a little bit more why I say that. One of the things that I've learned in the 2 years since I've been in office is that the process of police accountability, and this was a critical issue in the 2019 campaign in which I was elected, and it became an even bigger national issue in the wake of the murder of George Floyd, as many of us here on this call marched together in solidarity to demand that we give meaning to the phrase Black Lives Matter. Well, what does that take? As Judge Cordell said, it takes legislation, certainly. I wrote an op-ed in the summer of 2020 in the New York Times looking at the role that prosecutors need to play in police accountability. We have a jury deliberating right now. Yesterday was closing arguments in the first ever jury trial involving charges against an on-duty officer for excessive force, white officer, Black victim. Is anybody on this call really going to argue? Anybody really think that never in all of San Francisco history has a police officer ever used criminal excessive force while on duty? Why is it that this is the first case to go to trial? What does that tell us about the history we heard Otis and Judge Cordell talking about? Now, I don't know what the jury is going to do in this particular case, but I know that if we are serious about building safe, just, inclusive communities, if we're serious about making sure that folks like Sheriff Carter's brother trust police when they get stopped and don't fear for their lives, then we need to live in a world, in a city, where when those officers who use excessive force or who lie under oath or who violate the norms that we establish for them, when that happens, there will be consequences. There will be accountability, just like for anybody else, rich or poor, white or Black, officer or civilian. It's about equal enforcement of the law. And I'll tell you, trying to give meaning to that promise has been difficult. It's one of the things I've been doing since day one in office, and we have met resistance at every step of the way. We need to change state laws, and we've changed a few, but we have a lot more to change. We need to change the culture within our office. We've got a lot of internal resistance to the idea that we would ever prosecute police because we rely on them to make arrests in all the other cases that we prosecute. And we need to change the culture in the media, in the courthouse, amongst judges who assume that police officers are doing their job. And most of them are most of the time. But when they're not, and when they commit a crime, they have to be held accountable just like everybody else. Public safety depends on it. Integrity of our so-called justice system depends on it. And if we're going to be able to solve all of the unsolved murders, right? In San Francisco, about 92% of reported crimes will never result in an arrest, right? It's the police department's job. Sheriff Carter told you, they police the streets. It's their job. 92% of the time, no arrest is made. One of the biggest obstacles to police being able to successfully investigate crimes is that people don't trust them and want to talk to them. How do we change that if we don't have equal enforcement of the law? How do we build safer communities if folks who are witnesses or victims don't trust the police? So yes, DAs have a role to play. State legislature has a role to play. Judges have a role to play. And it's been my commitment to voters in San Francisco since my election in 2019 that I will enforce the law equally, because putting justice back in the hall of justice requires it.
Thank you. Otis, in your opinion, what does criminal justice reform mean in terms of policing? What are you seeing in your research and in your stories? And does it mean to defund the police department?
Absolutely, but we need a new phrasing. I'll just share a little story. I was editing a colleague who is tracking SB 16 records. And now that's a police transparency law that requires police to release data on police misconduct, but also how police are reprimanded for behavior. Now, there was a police officer in this town that used the N-word in front of his superior, a police trainee, and someone running for city council. His pay was cut for, like, I think 5% for 4 months. You look at the transcripts of the investigation, the investigator didn't bother asking this police officer, well, have you used the N-word before? Do you use it commonly? Do your friends use it? And that was good enough for a chief. A simple search of Facebook and you see, racist memes being shared by this officer. I think that needs to be taken into account when we talk about policing and who gets to be a police officer. Now, to your answer about defunding, I think the messaging is terrible, but I'm just curious, and I'd like to know what your thoughts are too. What if we took money from these outsized police budgets and invested it in, say, schools in neglected neighborhoods? What if every school in these neglected neighborhoods had functioning libraries? Do we think that more California students would be reading at grade level? And if they do read at grade level, perhaps they're able to comprehend questions better as they get older. And maybe that means they graduate or go to college or seek, gainful employment instead of being pushed into this prison pipeline. I'm curious, what would our cities be if more resources were put into social work, supportive housing, and street mental health professionals instead of policing? Policing will not address the root causes of crime, and the police are incapable of policing the police. So we need to start thinking differently about how we engage with our communities instead of turning over so much of our city and county budgets to the police.
Could I just jump in? Yeah. So I don't think anybody would disagree with what you just said, Otis, about how taking money, investing in communities. The key is, how do you get the money out of the budget? So when the budgets are put together for police departments, it is done with negotiations with the police unions. So, and all frequently, it's not done in public. It's all this secrets. And I think, first of all, the negotiations should be done in public. We should be transparency. But the hard part is that they have so much power because they have so much money to lobby people in Sacramento, to lobby even locally. So that's what you've described will bring a cultural shift. But the key is, how do we get there? So one example is in Camden. I mentioned the former police chief there. Camden, it was just the solve rate for murders in Camden was just kind of the lowest it could possibly be. And it was just the whole city, law enforcement, everything messed up. So what happened in Camden is that they just completely fired everyone in the police department, including the chief. And then they said, we're going to start over. So there was no union with whom to negotiate. And they said, if you were fired, you have a right, you can reapply here, but it's going to be a whole different mentality. We're going at policing in a different way. As a result of that, when the police department got reconstituted, I mean, everything wasn't perfect, but I know the murder rate went up, the solve rate went up. Why? Because community who knew people who knew about these crimes and about these murders were willing to come forward because they trusted the law enforcement agency. So it's one example, it's very extreme, but that's how the culture in policing in Camden was changed. It was that dramatic. I don't see any other way that this shift can happen. And you know, when the Sheriff Carter mentioned, you know, body cameras have changed policing forever. There is no question, because there are now eyes from the community on policing, which has never happened before. So for me, it's even less the body camera and more the iPhones, the cell phones that people have, that the public has, who can record what police do. So I'm glad about the body cameras, but of course we have issues where they're not turned on or the battery ran out. We hear all these excuses, but I'm glad they're there. But it's really the public with the cell phones, the videos, that have really started, and again, it's just to start, a cultural shift in policing.
Mhm.
Hey, can I say something,
Oh,
Michelle?
yeah, go ahead.
Again, I like what Mr. Otis said about putting money into our education. And that is very, very important. I'm a single mom. My daughter's 20 now, but you know, that is totally very important. I also think that we still do need money in our, you know, police departments. The body worn cameras cost money, to get it out, so that we can show you guys when people ask to see what's on the body worn camera. It costs money, training costs money. And we want to have a police department, sheriff's departments that are grade A up to par, where you all can say, yeah, these people are highly trained and I am going to hold them accountable because I've given them the tools that they need to succeed. And for instance, I'm part of the racial equity plan. I just got there, last year, and there's so many things we want to do to make our office equitable and how we treat people. And we don't have any money for it because money was taken away. And so I believe that we could reallocate that money in the departments to go towards programs, even our justice involved programs, and so I would hope that we can use those funds. We could work it out together. I would love to have even the judge, he has so many wonderful things to say of how we can use the monies that we have and reallocate them, not to go to trainings to Hawaii, but those trainings where it's de-escalation, crisis intervention. We actually started a cultural humility training. One of my friends started cultural humility training. And so at the Sheriff's Department, what we've been doing is it's a 4-hour training, and we talk about all cultures. We come together, we talk about our experiences, and it's been really eye-opening for others who may not have had a lived experience of being a person of color. And so we're trying to give our sworn staff the opportunity to walk in our shoes for a minute in hopes that that will spark change. And change, honestly, is here. I know, I'm the police officer, but I'm telling you, because of all of you and holding us accountable, change is here, and it's slow. So we miss it if we blink, but continue to have these conversations, continue to hold us accountable, and we will push this even farther. But there's definitely been change since I started 26 years ago. I am totally seeing the changes, and let's just reallocate the funds to do what we wanted to do. But education is very important as well.
Can I just pick up on the training thing, Juliet, really quickly?
Yeah, of course.
There was a 2016 survey done by the Police Executive Research Forum, and they found that police agencies around the country spend a median of 58 hours training recruits on how to use a gun, 49 hours on defensive tactics, but just 8 hours on de-escalation and crisis intervention. So it's an area, as the sheriff mentioned, that absolutely needs focus on. And I'm delighted to hear if indeed more time, and again, they need more money, is being allocated to do things other than train officers how to use guns and how to defend themselves.
And post, actually, I believe this last year, we have to do an extra 8 hours on the CIT, the de-escalation part. So it's shifting. I mean, even since 2016, post is now involved in making sure that we have the, implicit bias, the racial equity components. All of that is really switching. I believe since George Floyd, there has been a real shift since that occurred, and no one, even no police officer could sit there and say what happened was, typical. I cried. I'm a Sunday school teacher, and I tried to explain to my kids that Sunday how shameful I felt as a police officer knowing that happened. And I busted out crying. And my daughter came downstairs and she said, "Mom, we could hear you," because I tried to put the phone on mute. It was that hurtful to me because I wear this uniform. That should have never happened. And because of that, there's been a shift. And one of those even posts has made it so that we get the de-escalation. And so it's the balance is kind of moving.
Mm-hmm. I want to ask you one more question, Sheriff. Sorry, I know you probably want to take a little bit of a break, and then I'll bring it back to the DA who needs to leave in a few moments. Otis mentioned who gets to be a police officer. You've touched on the demographic of the police department. In your experience in law enforcement, do you think the increase in minority members of law enforcement is changing policing? And is the having more minorities in law enforcement helping achieve criminal justice reform?
I do. I'm part of, like she said, Noble, the National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Executives. And we absolutely have people that look like me who are in this for the long haul, who have rolled up their sleeves. In fact, the organization started back in '76 because they wouldn't let us be executives. They wouldn't let us be managers. And so that organization started because they treated us as less than. And now we have people who are chiefs and sheriffs who mentor us and who get us to these positions. And I'm like the one that's trying to reach back to bring other people be better than me. We need people that look like me, who understand what's going on, who have had experiences so that they can change it. And one of the reasons that I'm so glad to be the assistant sheriff is we already have ideas. We want to go, Mr. Otis, we do want to go into the schools. We want to start young so that our kids aren't afraid of us, so that when they grow up, they will know that they can be police officers, be qualified police officers, and do the things that we're talking about here to be fair and impartial, to be people of procedural justice, to give people a voice. We need those voices. And it's my mission to make sure that we have people that are Black and brown and women. Women have a totally different way of speaking to people. I'm sorry, men, we're just more calm. And we have a way to talk to people and treat people, and it makes things go so much more smoothly. And so we need women in law enforcement, and we need people of color. And I've noticed and I've heard that even in our justice system, when they see sheriff deputies coming through the pods that look like them, they feel a little bit more at ease because there's someone who maybe they can talk to, who have an understanding of what they have gone through, or maybe someone in their family. And so I would encourage anyone to get into law enforcement and be the change agent, because we need that.
Thank you. Before we go over to the DA, Otis, would love for you to touch on the criminal justice reform being seen as a progressive movement. It's in media, on social media and in reports, it's being seen as a progressive movement. But I think we all agree on, when we really break it down, it is a movement towards racial equality. Why isn't it seen as a bipartisan issue? And, why do we see millionaire Republican donors fighting against criminal justice reform?
Racism. I mean, how can I say this? And I'm speaking from a position where I think journalism is culpable for the pervasive negative narratives of people of color, right? We have to stop pretending that racism doesn't infect every system, every institution in this country, right? And when you have someone like the DA say, you know what, this system has been unjust toward people of color, particularly Black men, white supremacy will respond to that by wanting to replace the DA. Shout out to you as well for dropping Willie Horton's name in the New York Times interview today, that published today. But throughout history, white supremacy has erected a system that will blame people of color for the conditions that white supremacy has designed to keep them in. And so this effort by progressive DAs, the backlash is, we have had a pandemic. There are certain crimes have risen, and the response is we've got to jail more people of color. Instead of the response being the system as it exists doesn't address the root cause of crime. And money can just portray things in a negative light. Here's what I think ultimately is that San Francisco, like the Bay Area, like California, trades on this reputation of progressiveness and liberalism that is false. And we need our white allies to call that out with us. Call out that false liberalism and say, if you're really progressive, it means more than a sign in your window. It means showing up at the polls. It means saying that more money should be diverted to these programs instead of our police. It means saying that when Gucci or Louis Vuitton store is robbed, it doesn't mean, yes, we need more police presence to guard multinational billion-dollar companies, and we need that more so than we need programs for young kids who have are not getting quality educations, and their outcomes are very different from their counterparts who live in predominantly white neighborhoods. It is actually taking stock and going to events like this, but also representing that voice in voting.
Yeah. Boudin, would you like to jump in there?
Sure, absolutely. And I want to apologize for having to leave 5 minutes early. Some of you might have heard about the resistance the reforms we've been discussing tonight are facing in San Francisco. I'm up against the most well-funded effort to oust a sitting DA in the history of this country, funded by Republican billionaires, endorsed by the Republican Party. And in the middle of my first term in office, I need to jump off this meeting to go engage with the endorsement process with local clubs that are weighing in on the recall. So the fight is real, the resistance is real. And I want to speak just for a moment to follow up on a couple comments Otis made about what this really looks like on the ground. What we see the fraternal orders of police that Judge Cordell mentioned doing, what we see the Republican billionaires who are bankrolling the recall here in San Francisco doing, is tried and true. It goes back, as Otis mentioned, Willie Horton is the most well-known example of it, but it happens all day, every day. And what it is simple. It is exploiting tragedies, preying on fears to undermine policies grounded in empirical evidence and racial justice. That's what they do. They do it over and over and over again. Let me tell you what we do. Let me tell you what getting at root causes looks like, what criminal justice reform and public safety look like in San Francisco. It looks like a lawsuit that my office filed against 3 manufacturers of illegal ghost guns, because it is not enough. If we're serious about public safety, it is not enough to sit back and wait for another young man to get shot and hope the police can solve the case and then throw the book at him and send him to prison for the rest of his life. We need to prevent that crime from occurring in the first place. We need to be proactive. That's why when we look at the kinds of things we can do with this platform, the district attorney's office, to promote public safety, I'm proud that I co-sponsored a state law that would provide universal basic income to young people aging out of foster care, because we know that young people with no parents, where the state of California is their parent, is their guardian, are uniquely vulnerable to being victims of crime and to becoming arrested and justice system involved themselves. Those policies are the proactive public safety policies that we desperately need in San Francisco and across the state. Similarly, when we save money from reducing juvenile incarceration, which I'm proud to say we've cut by more than half since I took office, what do we do with those savings? We reinvest them in victim services. We've increased the number of Chinese-speaking staff in my office providing services to victims of crime by nearly 500% in just 2 years. We're meeting people where they're at, providing culturally informed and linguistically competent services to folks who've been harmed by crime, whether or not police are able to solve the case, make an arrest, or we're able to secure a conviction. And when it comes to criminal justice reform and public safety, I want to tell you one example of what that really looks like, where the rubber meets the road in terms of human lives, real people, public safety. At the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, we heard loud and clear from the director of jail medical services that the COVID-19 pandemic represented a grave threat, not only to people who were incarcerated in the jail, but to the sheriff's deputies that work there, to the public health professionals that work there, and to all of the communities and families that those folks go home to every night. We saw what happened across the country in jails and prisons where people ignored the risks of COVID-19. And so my team took action. We identified in that process a young woman whose only criminal conviction was a property crime, misdemeanor, and she was serving a jail sentence for it. She was young, she was addicted, and she had a high-risk pregnancy. In the context of a global pandemic, we made a decision that we were all safer, that public safety would benefit, that justice would benefit from releasing her early, not forcing her to serve her time in a jail cell with a high-risk pregnancy, but instead having her transported together in partnership with our reentry partners to a prenatal residential facility. And that young woman, instead of serving her time in jail, served her time in that prenatal facility. She gave birth to a healthy baby. She stayed sober. She graduated from that program. She has stable housing. She has a job, and she is still there caring for her child. That's what public safety looks like. That's where San Francisco values can lead us towards criminal justice reform that makes all of us better and safer. I'm so sorry I have to leave. I thank you for your time. I thank you for bringing us together to talk about these critical issues. And don't forget to vote. Have a great night. Thank you.
Thank you, Boudin. Thank you. Otis, going back to you for a moment, there seems to be more reporters than ever before covering the criminal justice system, or maybe it just seems like that, but very much it seems as if there's more focus on the system due to reform being such a hot topic. Yet many of the reporters don't know the nuances of the subject matter, how the system works. What does a judge do versus a DA versus the police department? What effect, if any, does that have on educating the public through their reporting, if they are lacking some of that understanding? Or do you think they aren't lacking that understanding?
No, they're lacking. Part of what my job here at KQED is injecting cultural competency into our news report. So often journalists, and you have to understand, we have operated under this idea of objectivity in journalism. And what I remind my colleagues of all the time is that that was a standard practice put in place when only white men were allowed to report the news, right? Cultural competency to me is understanding systems of power, right? And who has access to that power and how they're using that power to impact those who don't have power. A lot of my colleagues are white, and you have, this white lensing of stories that don't take into account what the systems of power and how long they have impacted people of color in this country. So what I do is I work on a story by story basis with my colleagues to make sure that their bias is in check, but also that they're actually giving voice to people that they wouldn't have ordinarily talked to. For instance, if you're reporting a story on the unhoused, you have to ask the unhoused for their opinion. If you're doing a story on incarceration, you have to reach out to someone who is formerly incarcerated or incarcerated to get their opinion. We have to let people speak for themselves instead of allowing people to speak for them. Because more often than not, the people who are speaking for the impacted do not have lived experience. And the people who will speak, or the people who will speak for the impacted without lived experience generally have, websites. They're easily reachable by email. They have PR people. They are of the system of power. And I really want to engender this idea that we have to go to where people are. And that is, if we're talking about reform, we have to talk to the people who have been impacted by this system. And they will tell you what they need, what needs to happen. For instance, the California's Reparations Task Force. If you don't know what that is, there is a 9-member body that is studying reparations in California, and we'll release they'll release a report this summer, but next summer they will actually release proposals. But what that body is doing, modeled after the commission that gave that investigated Japanese reparations, is they're going to do a tour. This time it's around California, and they're going to ask Black people what they think, what they need to be whole, really, what do they need to not be behind. And I think that's really important. And I really challenge my colleagues here to, if you're going to write about the systems of power, particularly this criminal justice system, you have to understand how it was erected. And it was erected to disenfranchise and oppress and marginalize people of color. Full stop.
Judge Cordell, would you like to chime there?
I'm just having a lot of random thoughts right now, with everything coming in. And let me just throw out very quickly, just a few of them. And I hope you all bear with me, and you may not agree with me with regard to just semantics. So again, I think if we start saying, a criminal justice system, we're saying there's justice in it. And I am hoping people can pick up on that and don't call it that until it really is. And another, semantic for me is minorities. Minority has a feel to me like calling someone an illegal. I'm not a minority, and minority implies something small, something not as good as majority. So I hope that in the media and all of us, we're people of color. I'm not a minority, and that's not what I am. So again, this is just a little thing that gets me, and I'm just putting it out there to you all. I want to make 2 other comments very quickly. When we were earlier talking about police unions that I call brotherhoods or fraternities, there's a New York Times article that came out in, I believe it was March 2021, and it was all about the power of police unions. And in the chat, I'm going to put a link to the article. But what they pointed out was that they summarized that the tactics that are used by these brotherhoods and fraternities when there is a push to change, it's a standard playbook. build a war chest, support your friends, smear your enemies, scare citizens with the threat of crime. So that's the playbook, and that's what's used all of the time. And I'll put the article in the chat. Last thing, institutions resist change. If it's the legal system, if it's the education system, could be a corporate setting, any institutions resist change. And the way change happens, if you look at history, it depends on leadership. When you get a leader, someone who has the courage to say, we're going in this direction, not where we have been going, that's when change starts to happen. So when you hear of progressive DAs saying change is happening, the immediate response is resistance, it's recall. And so what has to happen is that it takes courageous people to make these systems change. It's happening in the legal system. And that's why I talk about the legislature and passing laws, everything. And especially when we talk about Otis in the media has so much influence over our lives, so much. And change happens, meaning fair reporting, giving people their just due, when leadership acknowledges and says, yep, we've got racism baked in here and we have to get it out, and putting people in positions of authority and leadership to make it happen.
Thank you. I know we only have a few more minutes. I want to ask one question for all the panelists and then give a few moments for everyone to speak. Sheriff Carter, would love to start with you. If you had to give San Francisco and California a letter grade, A, B, C, D, F, where would the city, county, and the state rank in making progress in criminal justice reform?
You know, and I'm gonna have to abstain on that because I am a sheriff and I'm wearing this uniform tonight. But what I will tell you, when Otis was speaking, Mr. Otis said, cultural competency, we have to go where people are and lived experience. And that is actually my playbook. I don't know the playbook that the judge was talking about, but that is what I'm actually looking for police officers and sheriffs, people with lived experience, people with cultural competency. And we have to go where the people are to find out what they need. Mr. Otis, this is why I am here on this call, because I need to go where the people are to figure out what you all need so that you feel safe, so that we can have more of these conversations on cultural competency and have these lived experience. I'm learning so much just by listening to you all speak, and it's going to help me be a better leader. We absolutely need courageous leaders. We have to be able to stand up, even if it's by ourselves. I'm so thankful that I have certain people who support and understand that, but yes, we can do more. We can do better. We definitely need improvement, but I won't grade it. We just need improvement.
Thank you. Otis, your
Sure.
grade?
My grade. I would like to say, Judge and Sheriff, I appreciate y'all. As Black women, I just can't imagine what you've had to go through. On the week that the president nominates the first Black woman to be a Supreme Court justice, and just the backlash to the knowledge that he was going to do that. So I want to say thank you for being who you are and walking tall in the face of so much hate. So thank you very much. F, I don't know. I'm so just saddened by our, Mayor London Breed's approach to the Tenderloin. Like, what is progressive about occupying neighborhoods? That won't address the issues symptomatic of, people struggling. Poor education, poor health outcomes, and living in a landscape bereft of opportunity, that's that's not going to help. But I will end with this on my F. So 55 years ago, in the wake of nationwide protests similar to what we saw 2 years ago after George Floyd was murdered, there was this Kerner Commission that was appointed to investigate the racial uprisings that swept the country. And that commission found that state and federal government housing, education, and social policies, along with police brutality, the lack of opportunity, and many, many other issues responsible for racial unrest. The commission concluded that white institutions created it, white institutions maintain it, and white society condones it. And here we are, 55 years later, and communities of color, particularly Black folk, are still ailing because of the same problems. I expect more from San Francisco, particularly a city that claims it is the bastion of progressiveness. I expect more of California. Actually, I expect more of this country. And until we see sustained progress that is not met by backlash, where we get someone like the former president telling us that there is no racism. Until we get sustained progress that is supported and maintained, it has to be an F. I mean, I'm at an age right now where I cannot pretend otherwise. I cannot pretend that we don't have the power collectively to do something. We're just not.
Judge Cordell?
Before I give it a grade, I want to pick up on what Otis just said about the Kerner Commission, which was appointed in 1967 by LBJ. Everyone should pull up that report and read it. It is amazing. And it sets out clearly how racism has so divided this society and has been so destructive. After this report was done, LBJ gets the report back and he refused to implement any of the recommendations. And right after that, Martin Luther King was assassinated, and then the rioting hit this country again. We have not learned even from history, and that's why history is so important, because we should learn from it. So with regard to a grade, I believe that progress is measured not by how far we have come, but by how far we have yet to go. Given that, in my belief, I will give the grade of a D.
Thank you. Well, I know we're just about at time. I want to thank the assistant sheriff, the judge, and Otis, and the DA, who's no longer here, for coming to spend time with us, to detailing your experiences, your beliefs, and bringing your true selves here to the table. We really appreciate it as we try to get smarter on this nuanced topic with so many layers, from the history to what we can be to what we are now. So we again really appreciate you taking the time to speak with us, and I hope over time our grade slowly gets closer to maybe that C level that we are wishing for. For everyone who joined us, thank you. As I mentioned, I know a lot is happening around the world, and to take the time to be with us, we really appreciate it, and shows the power of community. And when we all come together, it gives us an opportunity to get smart and ask questions and hopefully move forward with progress. So with that, good night and thank you again. And Her Honor is a wonderful book by the judge. I hope you all take a moment to order it. Thank you again.
Thank you, Juliet, for moderating. I appreciate you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you for joining. Thank you. See you.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Very wonderful session. Very informative, and hope you do it again soon.
Thank you so much.